Good morning. It's a real pleasure to be part of this panel today, which has been organized with CAF and Argentina and several additional partners. My name is Facundo Chavez. I'm the advisors on human rights and disability at the UNCHR. And this is the opportunity to have a talk that I think we should have been having already starting a long time ago when we talk about an independent life and being able to live in community, which is the role of international cooperation in terms of the implementation and development of systems to support the independent and autonomous life in a community. Our panel is great, not just excellent professionals, but also friends. So let's just go directly to the panel. Just as an introduction, I wanted to say that the event's goal is to work on how international cooperation can contribute effectively and specifically to the development of public policies and to the implementation of systems of support for life in a community. We've been working together with at the OHCHR, with the CAF, with the Latin American Development Bank for some time in the planning, programming, and projects, which Iñaki will probably talk about today. And it's quite pleasing to see that this is becoming more concrete, that Argentina has already expressed that it will advance with this pilot program, if you wish, because we hope this is the beginning of a whole series that we hope to see the next few years. And before we move on, before I give the floor to the panelists, let me thank everyone that's part of the panel and all of you, the audience that is joining us with us today. I hope all panelists keep time. And in fact, if you could possibly speak a little less, that would even be better, so that we have some time for other people so that they can ask questions and make comments. We are at an interesting period because this week, and this whole month, in fact, there is a political negotiation in course to advance on what could possibly become the post-2030 agenda. And we will have a first political declaration that would be somewhat a midterm analysis of the implementation of the SDGs. We hope that all countries do include the rights of the people with disabilities when they make the political statement, but also we hope the programs would specifically emphasize systems of support and care that could allow people with disability to live independently in their communities, and that we could also move forward with clear processes, and so we don't leave anyone with a disability behind. The call has been made by the High Commissioner in February, but I will make the call again in this room, and I call upon all countries to move forward in this view. I will give the floor to each of the speakers, and will introduce them when I do. So let me now give the floor to Fernando Galarraga, the Executive Director of the Argentine Disability Agency. You have the floor. Thank you very much, Facundo. Good morning. We are so excited to be able to share this space for debate, and we know that throughout this year, Argentina has promoted a number of actions, politics, and programs to give back the state the role of the guarantor of people with the rights of people with disabilities. We knew it was necessary to do this using several strategies. First of all, we had to strengthen our own agency, the Argentine Disability Agency, a new agency which has important and relevant competencies for the life and the inclusion of people with disability. We manage the system for certifying disabilities, the pension systems for people who are not taxpayers, we manage the inclusion fund that finances civil initiatives from different governments in disabilities. We have the responsibility of financing and managing a federal program in the country to provide benefits for disability, benefits for people with disabilities. This required the task of modernizing our systems in order for these areas, because they were each a separate division before we created the agency. We had to make it all work together as a whole. And there are two important things that were also something we did. We included this agency as part of the state so that we could promote transversalization, because we felt we were quite behind with that in Argentina. Secondly, make it more visible socially. The disability continues to be invisible in many of our countries, and that is also so in Argentina. And we needed to really promote this so that it would be part of the political, the media agenda, the social agenda. So we would include this perspective. When you think about the autonomous life, the independent life of people with disabilities, you have to rethink systems in Argentina. For instance, the medical model that's dominant and that we want to change. We understand that international cooperation, the support of multilateral credit agencies, and the cross-cutting of this perspective in different areas of the state were and are key tools. One of the first steps that we took was to create a unit for external financing, which has been working with the Ministry of the Economy, with the Secretariat of Strategic Issues, which was able to, as a first step, include disability as a perspective in financing and in projects that are financed by international cooperation all over the state of Argentina. Everything financed from abroad has a number of requirements, and the perspective for disability is one of these requirements. We have 17 initiatives at the Ministry of Economies that are being financed, which is by infrastructure, sanitation, digital resources, transportation, and our team has been promoted the including of the disability perspective. There are two important initiatives. One's with CAF, which is to promote disability perspective in municipal governments. We understand that people with disability will and should develop an autonomous life in their own communities, and that is where local governments have to acknowledge that there are people with disabilities and plan and manage their local government. They're using a disability perspective. We're working on training, financing, creating services for inclusion and promoting the autonomous life of people with disabilities in over 200 municipalities in Argentina. This has been done. We have an initiative with the Inter-American Bank for Development, and that is to promote the certification of disability. We are transforming this certificate, CUD in Spanish. Cecilia will discuss that further, but we are modernizing the paperwork. We're making it simpler. So we can include technologies. We can train over 500 boards of certifications for disability in Argentina. We are emphasizing the social model certification that we have implemented in Argentina still has many things that it needs to review in order to align it with the social model and to the convention. This initiative is with that perspective. Recently, we've launched a plan to promote autonomous life. This is something that may be scary. We know that many financing institutions in our country somehow still think that this is not really something they know about. They don't realize how relevant this is, not just for an individual's life and a family life for someone with disability, but also by the state and all those who have the responsibility to manage public resources. The impact this will have to improve the opportunity for the budgets and resources that are always so limited could allow us to develop. We invested many resources, we do every month, by financing benefits for disability, but many have been reviewed because we feel they're still coming from a model that is very much older than the actual convention for people with disabilities. Just bringing up the debate among the teams, just to bring this debate at the management in Argentina, which is a specific systems. We have different financing entities, for instance, the Ministry of Health, the Superintendency of Health Services, and there's a number of bodies which are still not fully incorporated the perspective of a autonomous life and to promote through resources and mechanisms the full exercise of the rights of people with disabilities, especially what's been established in Article 19 in the Convention. It would take us a lot longer, of course, to do this, to set up the standards, to agree and establish these internal mechanisms, knowing that there are many, many organizations in Argentina that are working on these mechanisms to promote autonomous lives for people with disabilities. We then started working with these, and we are selecting more organizations, and we now have the first agreement to start to directly finance. The state will finance directly mechanisms that are moving forward in promoting autonomous life for people with disability efficiently. The organization that just established an agreement with us on Monday, last Monday, as a matter of fact, has been working with a residency where there are 4 people with intellectual disabilities who live by themselves, who have support mechanisms. But because of this agreement now, they will be able to be supported by specific financing and support them to develop their new experience in our country for them too. But we understand that to really include people with disabilities, we need to have specific acts that do impact their daily life. So we'll continue to work on that. Thank you so much.
Gracias.
Thank you, Fernando. I would like to take 3 points of what you're discussing. First, the structure of the state. The second is the relevance of international cooperation in order to be able to to push forward these changes, and that's something that happens very often. I mean, here in the UN, I mean, we also, well, so I would like to make these points, and in particular, I would like to make a reference to what you mentioned that has to do with being able to manage in this case, the National Agency for Disability, and also to keep things running. And at the same time, we need to count on international support so that we can think and we can develop transformative elements within the framework of the Convention for the Peoples with Disabilities. Now I will give the floor to Cecilia Clement-Cott. She's the director of the Institution for Citizens Participation and International Cooperation. Cecilia, you have the floor. Can you hear me? Good morning, everyone. I wanted to continue to follow the same train as Fernando and Facundo regarding independent living and the role of the state, because we often in Argentina we often say that we have rights because of the conventions, but the state has to have this fundamental role of to guarantee so that it can guarantee the fulfillment of all these rights. So starting by this, we have been working on a plan for the implementation on certification in Argentina. We have a single certificate of disability, as Fernando mentioned. And I would like to tell you that that is the key tool within our state so that we can gain access to all these rights. Within this perspective, we have begun some time ago to implement all this transformation that they have mentioned so that we can update everything related to certifications. Because of this, or thanks to this, we are implementing new regulations, and this implementation that, as Fernando mentioned, doesn't happen overnight, but it's done in a progressive manner. And also by doing this, we can also implement all this openness towards having more rights. Let's take into account that with this certificate, we are changing a fundamental connection. That is that in the past we had a hegemonic vision, and now we have this social vision. And no matter if we started with a condition of health, let's say, we are working towards the function, and thanks to this, we have implemented. I mean, we had a project. We wrote a draft for the legislation where we said nothing about us without us, and so all these regulations, we do this from the basis where people with disabilities. We have said that where we were told that we needed to transform this so that we can move forward. So thanks to this, we are currently implementing. We are making a national survey, and I wanted to share with you the relevance of this international cooperation. International cooperation has allowed us to achieve financing and to broaden the interdisciplinary boards. In Argentina, we have a very heterogeneous field in terms of reliefs, in terms of the geography of the country. There are places that are very far from the main cities, and the state has to be able to make its way there, and that's what we're doing nowadays. So with all this implementation, the changes that we mentioned before, that's what is allowing us to broaden this exercise of all these rights, and it's not as our slogan says, that we shall leave no one behind. And how can we do this? By the state being present, and that's what we have to do, and that is precisely what we have to do. We could speak for days and hours, however I'm going to keep it short. So from the Andes, I am at your disposal for any consultation or any question you may have. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Cecilia, y me quedo con este punto también.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. Yes, as Cecilia said, we also have to put all these things into practice, all these mechanisms for certification, so that we can move forward, so that we can provide more access for people with disabilities. That's one of the main tools that we have to keep in mind. I will now give the floor to Iñaki Regueiro. He works for the CAF, which is the Development Bank for Latin America. Iñaki, you have the floor. Thank you so much, Facundo. Good morning, everyone. I will now make my presentation about the Latin American Development Bank where I work. Well, we have the logo of the CAF and the motto towards a more inclusive region, green and productive. CAF is a development bank that is committed to improving the quality of lives and of everyone in the Caribbean and in the Latin American region. And what we offer is we do offer financing for the public sector and the private sector in our countries, and we also generate know-how to strengthen public policies. In the picture, we have a lady with 2 children. They're also smiling, of course. The CAF is made up by 21 countries. It was founded in 1968, so we have 56 years of history. We have 13 commercial banks in the picture. We have a map of Latin America as well as the Caribbean. I mean, the countries that are members of the CAF. And it's important to mention that in these many years, more than $200 billion have been invested for the development of the region. The Office for the Inclusion of People with Disabilities is led by Juan Pablo Salazar, who wanted to come, and he sends his regards to everyone, of course. So this office works to transform the cultural paradigm regarding disabilities in Latin America, and in order to do this, we use the social model in order to bring down the barriers that prevent people with disabilities from achieving access to their human rights. And we use this as a guideline for our everyday activities. Mainly, our work consists on offering credits, but also technical support for in our member countries. Next slide, please. There is an internal strategy that aims at the cross-cutting capacity of all these elements, but there's also an external strategy that has to do with 13 different axes. One of them is universal access, also support for development, and the third, which is the one that we're discussing here today, is inclusion in the community. And in this point, we aim at bringing people closer to public policies so that they can stay in their communities and that they can live their lives just as everybody else. In this regard, we want to deepen the topic of mental health and how we can finance all these strategies within the region, within this third axis of community involvement. To start working on this axis, the first thing that we did was we generated knowledge, and the Center for Inclusive Policy, the CIP, was tasked with coming up with a report on the region. Alberto will, I'm sure, he is going to speak, he's going to elaborate about this topic afterwards. But we wanted them to write this report so that we could have a clearer picture of the situation in the region, so that we could also implement strategies in this regard. And in this sense, the project that we're implementing in Argentina, that I'm happy to present to you, is called Torre de Inclusión, Tower of Inclusion in English. So we have a logo here with different people, executing everyday activities, and the image of the tower aims at bringing all the I mean, making the states be responsible for all of these policies. I mean, people should only have to go to one place and not to many places. And also, this aims at the fact that the state needs to have updated information about the current state of inclusion of the rights in their territories, right? So the challenge that we have
del modelo social.
In many countries is a application of the social model, the services for people with disabilities, because people, as I said earlier, have to go to different places, and sometimes it is very difficult to access their right. There are barriers in terms of system navigations. There is a need to access justice, and we can see this daily for people with disabilities, and also the violation of their rights, or many times the state needs to have updated data from the different territories.
En ese sentido, hay...
Specifically in Argentina, we have a grouping by themes in terms of the different rights that a person with disability has. I'm not going to go into so much detail, but you can see, for instance, benefits in terms of this disability, access to justice, support. Usually there's for people, personal support, and also their life plan that they can make, and they want to be able to access their different rights. This allows us to set up teams, circuits, and guidelines. Obviously, there are differences depending on the country. These themes lead us to people having an autonomous and independent life in their community. The project has 4 components: the diagnosis, the improvement plan, implementation of Las Torres, and evaluation. In terms of the diagnosis, we aim that each theme can be measured by an indicator that would tell us how much we have advanced in terms of the rights. You can't see the images, but I was planning to show you a traffic light, which would be the symbol of whether we're doing, how we're doing. We're red, green, or yellow. First, we would have an inclusion map for each of the areas and territories where we will have these towers. The second pillar would be an improvement plan in order to see if there are gaps, and if so, we could have significant advances in this area, working with the municipality and with the territory to improve the indicator in that theme. And the image here was also going from red to yellow, the traffic light. The third component is implementation. Basically, we would build the inclusion towers for people with disabilities so that they could come to access their rights. Finally, the last component is evaluation. For that, we have support from the Office of the High Commissioner of the United Nations for Human Rights, so that we could monitor the standard, the quality of care standard should be aligned with the convention and the changes that we want to implement for in terms of independent life in the community. Expected results about the project: to have a practical evaluation of public policies of the state, to be able to make sure and measure results of the application of the rights, to have an improvement plan for each territory so that the indicators can improve. And of course, we always try to do this gradually. We'd like to set up a network of services in each territory because they are different in every place. We would like to set up a network, and that would require practice, which we already have in territories. The effective right to your access to your rights is inclusion towers will not just be for advice, but also for managing your rights and to help someone with the needs. We aim to provide an individual and voluntary support plan for people, where people maybe need to do some sort of paperwork or get some support. They would have support and continuity in their management, and because the actual aim is to avoid social segregation and decrease the gap between effective application of rights and the standard of rights. And also, we want to incorporate the municipalities into this network of support, so that we can help the family in providing support, because many times it is the family that provides the support on their own alone, especially women. We would like to have the municipality take on that task as well. Also, we would like to be able to measure our results in inclusion in each of the different categories. What is the road ahead? To replicate and implement this project in Argentina, and being able to replicate this regionally, and in working with the work on the community access, we'd like to have generate credit and cooperation, technical cooperation for disability in Latin America. Thank you so much. This is a river, and it says CAF, the Green Bank and Reactivation of Economy in Latin America. Thank you so much.
Gracias, Iñaki.
Thank you so much, Iñaki, for your presentation. The project is actually quite good and really very much made tailored to Argentina with international support. That's important. Let me give the floor to Alberto Vázquez Escalada, the Senior Advisor of the Center for Inclusive Policies.
Buenos días con todos y todas.
Good morning. It's quite an honor to be with you at this table. As Iñaki was saying, the Center for Inclusive Policy worked on a research because of a request of the CAF and the UNCHR to see what's happening in terms of care and support in the region. What do we talk about when we talk about systems of support and care? There's been interesting evolution in the international debate. But for the report, following on what the Committee on the People with the Rights of Disability and the High Commissioner, we're talking about a service network, products and people who help people with disabilities to take decisions or for their daily activities. And the idea is that they could fully enjoy the right to live independently in the community. We use the term support because it symbolizes a change in paradigm that is gathered in the convention, looking towards autonomy and independence, which is the paradigm in the model of human rights for disabilities. But we also use the word care, underlying assistance necessary throughout your life cycle, especially when children, but also to make the important link between services and networks of support and the care agenda, because we know that in the region the care agenda is growing and it provides important opportunities for investment in services and networks of support. Why was it important to look at this agenda? I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but I think this is essential for the exercise of your rights. I think it's important to remember that we've always discussed the right to live independently and to be included in the community, and there's been important advances in terms of accessibility, cross-cutting, and we talk about employment and inclusive education for people with disability. How do we make society more accessible? However, there is less investment or attention when we talk about the specific agenda as to what kind of assistance the person may require in order to do their daily activities. And that's a problem because there is no connection between the individual and the services that we are transforming. Also, the agenda is important because it's key to guarantee something that the movement on disability has been discussing forever. What is the impact this has in terms of gender equality? I think that discussion needs to be there as well. And how do you distribute and redistribute non-remunerated care? There is no services, and then remember the traditional division of roles. We need to discuss that, and I think COVID-19 has forced us to have this debate somehow different than before, and it's a good opportunity for us to continue this conversation over time. What were our findings? First of all, there's very little information. There is I think I forgot how many countries, but I think there were 18 countries that we looked at, and we saw there's a lack of data in terms of the needs for support and the magnitude of the gaps. Many data that we are getting through census and services do not have information in terms of specific support needs. The data we've gathered through the certification processes for disability, we haven't systematized information to find out what the demand is. There is a challenge in terms of information. However, even though we have very little information, in some countries, say, that have had specific service on disability, we know people that are disabled have high need for human support, and these needs are mostly not met. Between 40 and 60% of in countries where we had specialized surveys has reported to have the need for human support, and a high percentage, 30 to 60%, said these needs for human support were unmet. So there is a huge gap in terms of human support. We used to say for a long time, we need to focus on those who have severe disabilities, but what the information that we have tells us is that these care needs go way beyond this group of which only is 3 or 4% of the population. The people who need assistance is much bigger. The group of people is much bigger. Information also tells us that these gaps are bigger in rural areas and among younger adults as well. There is also a level of support, informal support for care, and that we saw in the countries that we could have information from. 90% of the support that people get is directly provided by the family in a non-remunerated way, especially women and girls who provide this support. And that has a huge impact in terms of income, employment, decision-making power, and that is part of what we need to do with that and add to the agenda. There is the intersection between disability and gender. We looked at available information, statistically speaking, and we looked at legislation, policies, and programs. And we found there is uneven progress in terms of the building of an agenda. There are things that are prioritized over other legal frameworks that are very fragmented and usually insufficient, and very few countries actually expressly recognize obligations related to the right to live independently and to be included in the community. And we've seen some advances in communication technology and financial assistance, support technology and financial activities, but areas that have been totally left behind, like the housing or transportation. There is also a disconnect between implementation and the bodies that are in charge of this. We have a number of laws with obligations for the states, but very few programs and policies that support the legislation. I think we've seen the biggest progress in monetary transfers, but even so, the programs need to be rethought about how the programs have been established so that they could support an independent life. How we focus on the different advances, and that doesn't necessarily align to a focus on rights. To give you an example that we saw, that we highlighted at the report, is homes that are housing that is protected, that are being created in many countries in the region. It's been a good solution at the beginning. It was well received for housing. Many countries where this has been implemented liked it, but they haven't seen the impact that this could have in terms of the trans-institutionalization of people with disabilities. What happens is they go from big institutions to smaller institutions, and we have anecdotal information
En los informes recientes
that we've gathered at the recent report of the committee about whether these spaces are really, these housing spaces, are they really independent spaces, or are they similar to the models that are already there? We need to look at this before we can make a decision. We found there is a country that is doing something differently in terms of legislation, policies, and programs, and that is Uruguay. Uruguay International Comprehensive Care System has been able to widen the service offers and coordinate services and programs better. There's very little written on the real impact of these and what is the actual cost that this would be for that the states would incur. But it's good to see that the agenda is making progress. To conclude, perhaps, to talk about the future in terms of research, we need to work on normative frameworks that are stronger with focus on rights, because it's very fragmented. We need comprehensive policies that have the perspective of a full life cycle. We haven't really looked at this, and we need to raise awareness and improve available information in data and in research. Good practices need to be researched further. There's a lot to learn, and there's a lot more to do. Thank you so much.
Gracias, Alberto.
Thank you, Alberto. I wanted to tell you that I gave Alberto a little bit more time so that he could present the results of the research. Well, I will now give the floor to Pamela. She's the Executive Director of NGO Sociedad y Discapacidad from Peru. Pamela, you have the floor. Thank you so much. It is a great pleasure for me to be here with you all. I would like to mention 2 points from the civil society, particularly in the case of SODIS. We have been monitoring a few projects financed by the World Bank, by the International Development Bank, and we have also played a key role by providing accompaniment to people with disabilities and providing assistance. In Peru, this was called the process for formulation of care. In first place, I would like to emphasize on the fact that the support of multilateral organizations and cooperation, they do have a key role in the promotion of peoples with disabilities, and also in terms of securing their independent living. It has a direct impact and indirect impact, because, as we have mentioned, the projects of transportation, education, infrastructure, they do have an impact, a huge impact on people with disabilities and the environment in which they live in. These can be unique opportunities to attain their full rights, and they could also work as a bridge so that we can improve the living conditions of all these groups, as you have all heard in Latin America, I believe that the efforts in order to ensure independent living have been somewhat limited, and they have even replicated all this existentialist logic. So the projects that we have discussed and the several initiatives that have counted on the support of all these agencies, they can contribute to lay the groundwork for the services and policies towards inclusion. And I believe that in order to make them fully inclusive, we will have to have a solid framework in terms of safeguarding and guidelines that will take into account the full perspective of disability that we can demand, and we can demand their implementation from the governments. By doing so, we will be able to provide answers to the peoples with disabilities. I believe that the second point would be to secure the meaningful participation of peoples with disabilities in these processes by means of the organizations that represent them. I feel there are examples such as the 10 commitments of the World Bank, the environmental and social framework, and also the guidelines for implementation of the IDB that work as a reference of the things that governments should follow and how the banking institutions could also take into account all these guidelines. I believe that one of the challenges that we have pending has to do with having a more proactive role, and also in terms of cooperation. Cooperation needs to add people with disabilities and the different movements in the different stages, and especially in terms of the implementation of all these different strategies in order to ensure that all these goals are complied with. In second place, since we have been discussing this topic of independent living, or the systems of care, I believe there is a matter that is still pending in some countries of the region, and perhaps in the case of Peru, which is the case that I know better. It will allow me to share a few ideas. With the withdrawal of international contribution, the initiatives, and also because of the struggles for the financing, there is a challenge making the agenda of people with disabilities has become a challenge in terms of human rights. Work towards an agenda of human rights that will continue to be a concern for the state. And I believe that the topic of contributions and the care, that is a topic that highlights how we will achieve all this convergence between the different movements, and how the movement of peoples with disabilities, their demands that they have, the demands of people that have tasks related to care, in order to ensure that this agenda in terms of care do not leave outside people with disabilities. So in the discussion that we have in Peru, one of the key points has been the exclusion of people with disabilities in the first stages of negotiation of a policy of care that receive technical assistance, where international cooperation also took part. And this is an example, I feel, that that's not the solution. The voices of people with disabilities must be heard, and within the movement there must be a discussion, a debate about how we ensure that these topics are actually fully inclusive. Thank you very much. Thank you, Pamela. Charlotte McLean.
It's coming. Great. So it really is an honor to be part of the event today. And I'd like to thank CAF, the government of Argentina, and of course Facundo for inviting me to share some remarks on what the World Bank is doing to support independent living for persons with disabilities. And I just wanted to start off by saying that, the 10 commitments have been mentioned, but the bank is committed to disability inclusion and recognizes that disability inclusion is directly linked to its twin goals of reducing poverty and boosting shared prosperity. It's also important to note that inclusion is a prominent pillar in the bank's green, resilient, inclusive development approach, commonly known as GRID. So at the bank, I lead the work on disability inclusion, but I'm supported by focal points in all of the regions and increasingly in many of the countries in which we work. We have a disability inclusive accountability framework, which is a roadmap for World Bank staff that sets out some of the key areas and entry points for disability inclusion across the various sectors. What is important about this framework and relevant for us today at COSP is that the framework builds off and articulates the principles of the CRPD, but uses a development lens to that. So focuses on how to operationalize the various articles that are in the CRPD. The framework, as I said, covers all sectors, and it's a living document, so it's just been revised this year to keep up to date with the advancements within the institution, and it's available in Spanish on our website. The framework also spells out the twin track approach that the bank takes to development. And so what we do is to focus on mainstreaming disability inclusion into investment financing projects, but also to look at supporting standalone disability investments and the development of evidence-based and knowledge and disability data. And that's the approach that we're trying to push throughout the institution. And so in the context of Latin America, we have begun to invest more on understanding the disability landscape in the region. And about 2 years ago, the Latin America part of the bank released a flagship report on disability in Latin America titled A Path to Sustainable Development. And it was a very well-received report, a very in-depth report that states that at least 85 million persons with disabilities live in the Latin American region. I need to acknowledge that the report was led by my colleague Maria Elena Garcia Mora, and if you haven't seen it, I would strongly recommend that you do see it because it does provide a really great outset of information on disability in the region. So what I think I would like to focus on is how, based on that report, we've looked at continuing to build the evidence base for disability inclusion in the region. And so what we are doing currently is we have country-specific profiles for disability for most of the countries in Latin America. And what we do in those profiles is to set out the legislative framework, the policies that are in place, the critical government interlocutors for the bank, because the bank primarily works through government. And then we identify key organizations of persons with disabilities. And this is important because we have a framework at the bank called the Environmental Social Framework that requires us to have consultations in the development of projects. And so having a list of key organizations of persons with disabilities is helpful in considering how do you consult and how do you arrange stakeholder engagement. Now, we all know in this room that Article 19 mandates us to ensure that persons with disabilities live independently in communities of their choice. And I just want to say that I think it's really important that when we think about being independent and living in a community of your choice, we need to keep in mind that persons with disabilities do not only live in the urban space, that persons with disabilities also live in rural settings. When we talk about living independently, we also need to be very aware of bodily autonomy. I think that's a piece that we can't de-link from living independently. We then need to think about the intersecting elements. And so, for example, in the context of Latin America, where you have large communities of indigenous people, we need to think about how do indigenous people live independently in their communities, and how do we factor that into project design and into social policy. There's been a lot of discussion about care and access to services. I think we really need to think a bit more about how do we access community-based rehabilitation for persons with disabilities to enable them to live in their communities? So one of the things we've done at the bank is to develop a technical note on accessibility. And we've run a number of trainings for bank staff on what they need to know to think about accessibility. But increasingly, we're working with project implementation units in various countries to train those that are actually implementing it to understand accessibility. A very exciting feature that we have in the environmental social framework is an indicator on universal access. And this is important because what it helps us do is to monitor and keep track of how many projects actually trigger this universal access indicator. And this happens at the stage of project design. And as soon as you start to design a project, you're prompted to say, have you addressed aspects around universal access? And so that has been an important piece of our work. I think another feature that is extremely relevant for living in the community is the right to be able to participate in civic affairs. And to that end, the bank has developed a note on citizen engagement, which is again directed towards empowering persons with disabilities and bank staff that are designing projects to ensure that persons with disabilities have voice and can hold local and municipal governments accountable. So to operationalize independent living in the region, some of the things that the bank has engaged in has been to support accessible transportation projects in Lima, Bogota, and in other capitals. We've also supported universal access in Buenos Aires. But in closing, I just wanted to note that ultimately, this agenda is driven by the capitals. It's driven by the governments. And therefore, I think there is a really important role for organizations of persons with disabilities to engage with their respective governments to ensure that investments and requests to the World Bank and other multilateral donors are in fact inclusive of persons with disabilities, and that infrastructure is addressing the needs of persons with disabilities, and that accessible and that housing is addressing issues around accessibility, and that access to care is also accessible, and ensuring that nobody is left behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Gracias, Charles.
Floor to Susan Doria.
Muy buenas tardes a todos.
Good afternoon. The IDB is very pleased to cooperate on this event along with ANDES and the CAF, the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, among others. And now I will share with you the way that the IDB has been advancing in inclusion of people with disabilities in the region and how our projects with approach the cooperation of the international cooperation for people that to live an independent life. Let me start with a review of three fundamental aspects. As many of you know, people with disabilities represent a considerable portion of the population in the region, and this collective is growing constantly. According to an IDB study, the population would increase to 150 million people by 2050. It is also important to think about the number of studies that show the persistence of gaps in terms of life, conditions such as education, employment, poverty among people with and without disabilities. And one positive thing in Latin America and the Caribbean is that they stand out because all of the countries in the region have ratified the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, which it represents a legal framework in common that gives us a clear guide for international cooperation. Following the concept of disability in the convention, the agenda at the IDB focuses on eliminating barriers that could be in attitude or in the environment. Using this focus, since 2019, we've approved over 60 loans which have included inclusion of people with disabilities according to specific and concrete criteria. In order to do this, it was fundamental to have the cooperation of civil societies and other organizations, international and national organizations. The first example of this cooperation, let me mention what we did together with the Argentine Disability Agency. The cooperation began with a specific challenge, which then extended to other actions. The first project was financed by the Japanese fund and support for the digitalization, articulation, and interoperability of processes and databases using a new information system from Andes. Recently, we approved a loan which aims to promote effective access to services and benefits that were established in the national norms in Argentina, promoting at the same time an independent life for people with disabilities. This loan has been 100% to have the inclusion of people with these abilities, and loaned by BID and the Andes, and Argentina with Ecuador have been cooperating with the IDB through direct investment loans. These loans are 100% directed to the inclusion of people with disabilities. Let me underline these challenges because they have the potential of transforming ecosystems for the inclusion of people with disabilities, improving the coordination and articulation of services in different areas. Next, please. The areas, the focus on challenges are in all the sectors of the bank. While I have not enough time during my presentation to mention specific examples in each sector, I would like to mention a couple of challenges. Next, please. The project Pacto de Productividad, Productivity Pact in Chile, is a public-private partnership promoting employment for people with disability through training of the companies and by inclusive labor intermediation. The project Mapeo lo accesible and Map what's accessible. It tries to promote more accessible cities in the region. There was a survey that we sent out, and 60% of people with disability told us that they do not have the necessary information in terms of accessibility of infrastructures like government offices or clinics or museums so that they can use these services in their cities. We are working with civil society and with the mayors to close the gaps and map concrete indicators of accessibility. Finally, we also know that we need more data. It is also important to change the public perceptions in their project Set, Ready, Go inclusion, or Listos e Inclusión. We've promoted this in 11 countries in the region. This Pacto for the transformation of the life of athletes and society was quite evident last week when we saw the Pan-American Youth Games in Bogota. To conclude, I just want to say that we still have a lot of road to cover. So I do hope today's session brings international cooperation to promotes international cooperation so we can promote the independent life for people with disability.
Bueno, quiero agradecer.
I'd like to thank all the panelists and apologize to the room because I was a terrible moderator because we don't have enough time for questions. However, let me invite you all to chase the panelists in the hallways and ask them all the questions you might want to ask them. They will stay today and tomorrow, so I'm sure you will be able to catch them, and they may expand their views. I'd like to thank all of the presenters and on behalf of the office, I'd like to think that we can promote our dialogue so we can have it among the movements of women, of the gender movement, and the movement of people with disabilities. I hope this takes the next step and gets another breath of air through these new initiatives for the autonomous life that also contribute to the right of women and the right of people with disabilities. And to conclude, I would like to give the floor to Fernando so he can conclude. Thank you. Thank you, Facundo. This was a really good task, and it was a very nice opportunity to bring this to the debate so we can continue to build consensus and learning. I'd like to thank my country, Argentina, because many of the things that Iñaki and Pamela have said are part of the working agenda for the Argentine Disability Agency. We're trying to combat the fact that we try to help so many people that are isolated, that all the difficulties that they have when they want to do any paperwork. I'd like to thank all of the trust that CAF and the Inter-American Development Bank has given us to the Argentine Disability Agency. It's the first time that our country has received this external financing for disability with specific resources that help us increase the role of the state. I welcome the work we're doing with the IDB and with the CAF, and we trust that we will be successful, and we hope we continue to do much more. I would also like to thank the Argentine mission to the United Nations, which has facilitated and helped us with all the support for this event. And I'd like to thank the team of the Argentine Disability Agency who has worked tirelessly so that we could have this debate and for this to be successful. We know there's a lot of challenges ahead. I think that we're trying to change the views and minds in Argentina and also regionally in terms of people with disabilities. Let me thank the World Bank, because the World Bank has just joined us as a advising entity for the agency for the Disability Network, which will help us promote public policies to try and include our peers. And I think all of this results in work that must be sustained. It cannot stop, and that must find us working together so we can change the life of all my peers in the region. There's a lot of exclusion, there is a lot of stigma, and there are a lot of barriers that we need to bring down. But we trust the potential of people with disabilities, the international agencies, international cooperation, our governments and states, so that we can work together to bring down the barriers and change the daily life of people with disabilities in Argentina and beyond. Thank you so much. And we'll stay around. You won't have to run behind us so long to find us. So have a great day.